All right. So ego. Before I get started on the topic of ego, let me ask you a question. Actually, it's a question I want you to ask yourself. Do you love yourself or hate yourself? Do you love yourself or hate yourself? Then ask, who is the one doing the evaluating? In asking that question, it showcases the duality. We have this idea that we have this self that we can evaluate that's separate from us and somehow can evaluate as good or loving or lovable or something that's to be hated. That evaluator that's evaluating the self, that's the ego. The ego is often confused as the I or me or myself. And yet somehow that ego can create the separation and evaluate self. And it's very interesting because you don't see this in animals. As far as we can tell, animals neither hate nor love themselves. And certain animals are quite joyous because they don't evaluate themselves. And the ego, this thing we call self or I or me, a really good example of how it's not you is when you fall asleep, where do you go? You're no longer aware of this self, and yet you still are. If you were to fall asleep and someone came by, you would still be there and they could wake you up. And when you woke up, you would be you. So there is an example of how the ego is not the essence of who you are. Another way of describing it, of talking about it is imagine if I handed you a cup of tea and I asked you to describe it. And let's say you take me literally and you describe the cup and the tea, that the cup is made out of ceramic, that the tea is a chamomile tea and there is a tea bag in the water, and that has given the water now color and flavor. And you start describing all the different flavors within the tea. And let's say you exhaust the description of the cup of tea, and I ask you, what else is there? And even after you described molecules and you've described temperature and have exhausted all that, I still ask you to describe more. And you say, well, why? What else is there to describe? And what many people don't do is describe the space that the cup holds. It doesn't describe I guess the function of the cup, how the cup is creating by its material this space to hold water. And so describing all the things that make up the cup of tea is kind of like describing, well, who are you? You know, and taking personality tests, Myers-Briggs and all these things. But the space that is created for the cup by the cup that holds it that's the equivalent of your essence. And if the cup were destroyed, that space, it doesn't just disappear, it goes back into space. And if I were to somehow find all the pieces and glue it back together, all of a sudden again, the space that that cup contained is there again. And if I can't put the cup together, but create a new cup, again, out of the nothingness, the space is created again. You're that space, you're that essence, you're that, you are what underlies the ego. The ego defines itself by picking reference points. The ego cannot exist without comparing itself to something else. I know I am Latino because I know what not Latino is. And I define myself as male because I know what not male is. So the comparison. But I don't usually include in my description of myself as having red blood that carries oxygen. Because almost all life forms on this planet have red blood that carries oxygen. So it's harder to describe yourself as that because that's not a contrast. So the ego gloms onto the differences. And the ego, when shaped in a certain way, not only gloms onto these differences, but tries to glom onto those differences that make us feel better or superior. The ego then starts to create these images and these thoughts, these expectations. And when those expectations, those images don't coincide with reality, that friction between reality and our expectations causes suffering. When you first had that first crush, that first time you fell in love, the ego created this wonderful image of what the other person was. But when you finally got to meet that person, or when that person rejected you, the reality clashed with your image that the ego had created, and it caused you suffering. And we can find many examples throughout today alone of where the suffering was caused by your ego having a certain expectation of what reality should be, and reality not meeting those expectations. So you're not ego. You're not this thing that usually you describe as I or me, that there's something underneath, an essence. How do we get to that? How do we become aware of it? The initial steps of awakening is when we can program into our ego this idea that this humility, that my expectations or my images are not always right, and very often are incomplete. So it's not so much about right or wrong, it's just they're incomplete because they're based on just our own thoughts. And so when you start softening the ego that way, when you're able to shape or reshape your images and your expectations to conform with reality, you start to weaken the ego. And the more and more you do that, the more and more you start getting a sense of that there's something underneath, something more, something beyond the thoughts, beyond emotions, beyond the sensations. The imagery also described in Buddhist texts is that of a wave. Your ego is like the ripples. And when those ripples form into waves and eventually crash upon the shore and disappear, what happens to it? Well, while the wave may disappear, the water that makes up the wave doesn't. It goes back into the ocean. So this ego is this really tiny ripple or wave compared to the immensity of the ocean. As you begin to challenge ego, as you begin to just ponder, is this who I am? Is this what I am? Am I something more than that? And keep in mind that your ego and your perceptions are incomplete. Those things start to weaken the ego and allows you to capture a glimpse of that thing that I struggle to describe. When you catch a glimpse of it, as many of us probably have, and maybe not have realized it, it's very difficult to describe in words. And so that's kind of one clue that you've kind of touched it already or are aware of it. When you're aware of something that is indescribable, that you're not able to put into words, something deeper underneath, then there's a good sign that you have caught a glimpse of what that essence. So I'll stop there. This is definitely not a topic that's easy to cover in the 10 minutes. But I think I've shared enough to get you started on the questioning or just being aware of your ego and being aware of what it does. So I'll open it up now and allow for any questions or comments, thoughts, maybe other stories you've heard about how to describe the ego that you found helpful.
So how do you compare the ego to the non-self? Or like, what's the difference? Or I'm confused.
Good
So
question.
like, ego's not real because we're interconnected. And the way I understand the non-self is like when we die, like animals, and we die and break down, and then those ingredients and proteins get reused to build something else. So that's why we're all interconnected and there's no self. So
Yes,
I don't
and
understand what's the ego. Like, it's not real.
good
It's
start.
okay.
That's a great start. Like so many things in our heads, even in my understanding of ego, it's just incomplete.
Okay.
There's more. So remember that no self is also sometimes called emptiness.
Okay.
And so it's a translation issue. And emptiness is more similar to that space that the cup holds. Right? That the cup itself doesn't create the space, it's there. The cup just gives it a temporary definition. And
Okay.
when the cup is shattered, the space goes back to space. It doesn't disappear. Nothing is created or destroyed. And if you create another cup, the space is there again.
So it's like condition? No, what was the word? Like nirvana was not unconditional.
Yeah, is that the unconditioned? I remember the phrase that I used.
Yeah, okay, but it's like, so things are empty and you give it a meaning. Something like that. Like I'm reading that book, The Tree of Alignment. Is
Okay.
really long. And I honestly I'm skipping the chapters that go through the history because it's just a bunch of like foreign words. And getting more into the philosophy itself. So it was like you are handle a knife. So if you grab it by the handle, is positive. But if you grab it by the blade,
blade.
it will be, so is we give it significance, I guess, or condition to things. Like we, like things happen and we, I don't know.
So
This
the
is,
condition is that point of contact between blade and hand versus blade and handle. So that contact there then causes an arising of meaning, and that meaning is often dependent on your ego, what your ego defines it as.
yes.
I could be holding on to the blade to just simply hand it to you,
Mm-hmm.
in which case that's safe. But that the definition of safe means that I'm not being cut, that you're not getting cut. All right? And I can hold the blade from the handle and accidentally stab you, and in that case, then it's not safe anymore. It's harmful.
Oh yeah, okay.
So there's that the interactions help to define when something is healthy and unhealthy, or skillful and unskillful. And what I am finding is that eventually all that's wrong. Eventually all that is not wrong, but incomplete also. And so it is, you need those steps first to think of it that way, to think of it in terms of waves and ocean. You need to think of it in terms of cup. You start there. And as you continue to mull it over, as you continue to study it, then you start realizing a deeper understanding. And it's hard for me to talk about it because my novice insights are really sensations or internal feelings. I telepathically convey it to you, I would, and it would be much more accurate than any of the words I've said today. And so for me, that's how it came about. I started with the words, started with the imagery, and eventually, as I continued to work on it, there was just understanding that can't be put in correctly into words.
Isn't that how we build this idea of this self? The I that says I am an independent, permanent thing. I am Leon Bryant. Somebody had a good story. They said, so you're getting ready to go to bed, you got big plans for tomorrow, and you say, I am going to set my alarm. I'm going to get up at 4:30. I'm going to hit the ground running, and I'm going to do all these things tomorrow. I, the one I. And then your alarm goes off at 4:30. And all of a sudden, there's another I in control. It's not the I that made all those plans. This is the I that says, oh, I didn't sleep that well, and I don't want to get up, and I. So I think what that kind of made me realize is not only is there no permanent I, we create different I's all the time depending on the conditions that we're in. And none of them are permanent, and none of them are real. They serve us. We have to have some sense of centeredness because we are moving through this phenomenal world, right? But this I that I create from moment to moment is not permanent. It is a creation of the mind only. And so what you guys are saying is exactly right. We have to use, our experience of a phenomenal world to try to kind of guide ourselves around it. But eventually we realize that we just let all that go. And once we let it go, there's the real self, the real person there.
And to give more a scientific approach to this, we have yet to define a place where the self resides. what the current theory of the self is from psychological and neuropsychological perspective is it is the interaction of multiple parts of the brain. So there we go again, this condition, this interaction, this point at which multiple things come together, and from it arises this thing that we call self.
It's a composite.
Huh?
It's a composite.
And
It's
it
created
does
from,
not, it
it's
doesn't
conditioned
exist.
by other things.
It is conditioned by other things and does not exist. We cannot find a place that we can say, here lies the self. It's interesting. The one thing that we do find that's most closely associated with the self is something called the default mode network. And it's a network of different parts of the brain. So again, it's not one part. And that is the part that most quiets down in expert meditation. That is the part of the brain that is most associated with suffering or unhappiness when it's highly activated. And it's the part of the brain that makes us constantly, our thoughts constantly wander. The monkey mind is what the Buddhists call it. That part is actually, we can find the monkey mind in the brain.
But it's a process, right?
But
It's not a
network.
thing, it's a process.
It's a network of different parts of the brain working together. And so that's like that's the ego. The ego arises from this process, from this interaction, from these conditions, whatever word you want to use. It's an interaction of multiple things, and then there arises this artificial entity that we call self that disappears when I go to sleep, that changes, as Leon pointed out, when the conditions change. You know, yeah, the ego. The more and more you can tell yourself, "I am not my ego. I am something more than that." The ego is part of it, but I am more than the ego. That's when you start to reprogram and you start getting deeper insight into the essence. What benefits come from that? I can talk about some of the benefits I have seen in myself. A lot less fear, a lot less death does not bother me the way it used to. And I've lost family members, and they are shocked at how calm and peaceful I can stay shortly after the death of a close family member. I suffer. I don't get offended as much. I still do. I still have an ego. I'm not perfect. But I'm able to take those insults and those attacks on me not as personally, because I know I am not my ego. The part where I may be missing out more is just recognizing there's this thing in Buddhism I haven't quite mastered, seeing myself in the other. And I can kind of get it up here. I understand it at a cognitive level, but I have not had that inner insight yet, that wisdom that comes with more and more meditation. So it's a process. It's something you gain over time and you work on it. And reading the Tree of Enlightenment is a great way to get started.
I also read, before reading the Tree of Enlightenment, I read Buddha in Your Backpack, and it's aimed towards teenagers, but it's a lot easier to read and understand, like really hard concepts, like explains the no self, like imagine a car. What part is the car? The tire, the steering wheel, like only when it's all together is a car. So it's somewhat, like it has like metaphors like that. So it's like, it's not as deep as Tree of Enlightenment for sure, but for it makes a good beginner book.
But when that car breaks down and it gets abandoned and starts rusting and goes to the scrapyard, is it still a car? And they start smashing it and breaking it apart. Is it a car then? Was it ever really a car? What is a car?
Exactly.
So there's I heard another good example along that same line. That's really good about, take something as simple as a ballpoint pen. You know, it doesn't have a zillion pieces, but you hold it up and go, what is this? Everybody says, well, that's a pen. So you unscrew it and you take the two halves apart. Is it still a pen? Well, yeah, I guess so, because you could put it back together. You know, then you take the ink thing out and you take the spring out and you take the little thing off, and pretty soon you've got, 10 or 12 parts there. Is it still a pen? Good question. I don't know. Why do we call it a pen and think of it as some distinct object that's permanent? Very good stuff.
Yeah. And I'm glad you both brought up impermanence, because that is so much a part of understanding ego. And so, yes, when you see that word impermanence, pay attention, because it gives some really good clues and really helps.
You know, if ego was permanent, if the I was permanent, then I'd have no problem bouncing out of bed at 4:30 when the alarm goes off, right? Because the same person would be in charge then that was in charge when he made the pledge, right?
Yep.
And you go from like a small child, ignorant, and you grow and you acquire new information, so you're a new person. And even as a grown-up, you change.
Mm-hmm. Now I am this, or now I am that, right?
Yeah.
Interesting little side note, we're not born with a self. The concept of a self is something that we don't have until several years later. It's one of the reasons why, no, actually, it starts forming within that first year. A baby interacts with the world as if everything is him or her. There is no separation. Everything is baby.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not until the brain starts to realize that when I touch mommy, I'm only getting signals from my hand, but when I touch myself, I'm getting brain signals from my hand and my face. That's the beginning of self, and that's separation from others. So those are the initial neural pathways that are developed that are the basis for the self. So it's something we develop over time and something we add on to, something that we take Cosmo quizzes so we can learn more about. Although the fascination with astrology is this idea of trying to understand the ego and build it up even more. And then add to it, I'm a Virgo, I'm a Scorpio. That becomes adopted into your identity, your ego.
I can see into the future.
And that's part of my identity. I'm a prophet.
Yeah.
Or I'm a healer.
Yeah.
So we take on a lot of things, we add on to this ego thing, not realizing that we're more.
Tara Brach calls it the small self. She describes it as a spacesuit that after we're born, we create a spacesuit that we live in, and it's necessary, it's functional, it helps us get through the real world, but it's not who we truly are. The ego is when we have the misbelief that that spacesuit that we've created artificially is what we are.
And as you progress, also, the temptation is there to go the wrong way of thinking and thinking you no longer have to take care of the spacesuit. Oh, I'm more than my ego, so I don't need to feed myself. I don't need to care for my body, and there's been many stories of people who have taken it so far as to commit suicide. And so just because you are more than your ego does not mean that you can't continue to take care of your body, of others, of those around you, of your mind, and staying healthy. So if you find your thoughts heading in that direction, that's not the right path.
Yeah.
So that's a warning sign, because it happens frequently.
And Buddha did that. He, well, I mean, what we think, because I don't, it was just by word of mouth, but he, whenever he first started his journey, he was starving himself, and then that's when he found the middle path, or the middle
Yes.
way.
That's it. Very good. Yes. Someone's been studying.
Oh, there's a series on Netflix, but I haven't finished it because you have has subtitles, so because I don't know Indian.
It's a good. I started watching it too, but it's long. Was it like?
Yes,
Oh my god!
it's so, I love it. Like, it's so beautiful, like the
It was-
outfits and everything.
Yeah, it was a very popular soap opera, but it was the Buddha story in India, and so yeah, that's where it came from. All right. Any other questions or thoughts, comments? No? Good. Well, so you are more than your ego. Your ego is there, but it's also not the totality of who you are. And because it is impermanent, the ego can be changed. The ego can be given less strength, less power over your happiness. And the more you're able to get in touch with that essence of who you are, the more you're able to keep the ego from building these expectations, the less you will suffer. The happier you will be, the more at peace you will be. So good luck with that journey. It's the one that I'm on. I think all of us are still on, but I have found it to be a journey worth taking. And so I hope you do too.
What is it they say? An expectation is a disappointment waiting to happen.
I like that. I've not heard that. That's a good one. All right, everyone.
Take
On
care,
that note,
everybody.
Good
and that
night.
note of wisdom, take care,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.